I was standing in the drizzling mist outside Grandview Estate when my daughter Sophia's future mother-in-law approached me with a condescending smile plastered across her face. "The bride doesn't want you here," she declared, waving a crumpled invitation in my direction. "Close family only." I simply nodded calmly, reached into my purse, pulled out my gold master key, and watched her perfectly composed expression completely shatter as I unlocked the towering mahogany doors. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "How interesting," I replied softly, stepping through the entrance I'd walked through thousands of times before. Considering I've owned Grandview Estate for the past 12 years. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story of family betrayal, hidden success, and ultimate vindication, I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below because this story has resonated with people from all around the world, and I love seeing our global community come together. And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow I have an even more shocking story about a mother who discovered her son's fiancé was trying to steal her inheritance. Trust me, you won't want to miss that one. Now, back to what happened at Grandview Estate, because the journey to that moment of sweet revenge began 3 years earlier. And it's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty and the power of quiet determination. My phone buzzed on that ordinary Tuesday morning in September, displaying my daughter Sophia's name for the first time in nearly 6 months. We hadn't spoken since our last argument about her relationship with Marcus, a relationship I'd never quite understood but had learned to accept for her sake. When I answered, her voice was practically vibrating with excitement. "Mom, I have incredible news," she said, her words tumbling over each other in her enthusiasm. "Marcus proposed last night at the Botanical Gardens, and we're planning our dream wedding for next spring." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I replied, genuinely happy for her despite our complicated history. "Congratulations to both of you. I'm so excited for you." "We've already started looking at venues," she continued, her voice taking on that dreamy quality she'd had since childhood when talking about something she truly wanted. "And Mom, we found the most perfect place. It's called Grandview Estate, this gorgeous historic mansion in Millbrook Valley. The gardens are absolutely breathtaking, and the ballroom has these crystal chandeliers that look like they belong in a fairy tale." My heart nearly stopped. Of all the wedding venues in our state, of all the beautiful locations she could have chosen, she'd fallen in love with the very place I'd poured my heart, soul, and every penny into for over a decade. The universe certainly has a twisted sense of humor sometimes. "The only problem," Sophia went on, completely unaware of the bomb she'd just dropped, "is that they're booked solid for the next 2 years, and their prices are way beyond what we can afford. It's like $40,000 just for the venue, not including catering or anything else." I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing. What she didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I was the owner of Grandview Estate. After my bitter divorce from her father, I'd taken my settlement money and made what everyone called the most foolish investment of my life, purchasing a crumbling 19th century mansion that real estate experts said would bankrupt me within a year. "I know we haven't been as close lately," Sophia said, her voice growing softer and more vulnerable. "But you always promised you'd help with my wedding when the time came. Do you think maybe you could use some of your connections to help us? Get a booking? I know it's a long shot, but this place means everything to me. Let me see what I can do," I promised, already knowing exactly what strings I could pull, because they were my strings to pull. What Sophia didn't understand, what her father had spent years convincing her of, was that I wasn't the financially struggling single mother they all believed me to be. During our marriage, Robert had constantly belittled my business degree, insisting I stay home to be a proper wife and mother. After our divorce, when Sophia was 15, he'd filled her head with stories about my supposed incompetence with money. Your mother couldn't balance a checkbook if her life depended on it, he'd told her repeatedly. Thank God I'm managing your college fund and keeping you away from her terrible financial decisions. The cruel irony was that while Robert was spending lavishly on his new wife Patricia and their expensive lifestyle, I was quietly building what would become the most successful luxury event venue in the tri-state area. I lived modestly in the estate's renovated carriage house, reinvesting every profit back into restorations and improvements, all while operating under the business name Millbrook Valley Events instead of my own name. I had my reasons for the secrecy. Robert's constant criticism had taught me that my successes would either be dismissed as luck or somehow used against me. Better to let my work speak for itself while I built something that could never be taken away from me. Over the past 12 years, I'd transformed Grandview Estate from a crumbling relic into the most sought-after wedding destination in the region. The grand ballroom now gleamed with restored crystal chandeliers, the gardens bloomed with carefully curated seasonal flowers, and the mansion's 23 rooms had been meticulously returned to their original Victorian splendor. I'd also acquired 2 other properties, Riverside Manor and the historic Blackwood Inn, creating a small empire of luxury venues. But none of that mattered to my daughter, who still saw me through her father's distorted lens. To Sophia, I was still the woman who'd failed at marriage, who lived in a tiny cottage and worked odd jobs to make ends meet. She had no idea that her supposedly struggling mother had built a multi-million-dollar business from the ground up. The following week, I arranged to meet Sophia at a coffee shop near her apartment in the city. She arrived 20 minutes late, distracted by wedding planning apps on her phone, completely absorbed in her own world. I spoke with the events coordinator at Grandview, I said carefully, watching her face. They've had a last-minute cancellation for May 15th. The date is yours if you want it. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief. That's impossible. Their waiting list is 2 years long. How did you manage that? I have some connections in the industry, I said simply. And regarding the cost, consider it my wedding gift to you. Everything's covered. Instead of gratitude, I saw suspicion cloud her features. Everything? Mom, that place costs a fortune. There's no way you can afford something like that. There. It was Robert's influence, still poisoning our relationship after all these years. The automatic assumption that I was still the financially dependent woman I'd been during my marriage, incapable of achieving anything significant on my own. I've done better for myself than you might think, I said gently. I'd like to do this, for you. Sophia's expression softened slightly. That's really generous, Mom. I mean, really generous. Thank you. She hesitated, then added with a warning tone. But I should let you know that Marcus's mother, Vivian, is very involved in the planning process. She has very specific ideas about how everything should be done. That should have been my first red flag, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I was too caught up in the joy of finally being able to give my daughter something meaningful, something that would show her I was more than the failure her father had painted me to be. Little did I know that Vivian Ashworth would soon become the architect of the most humiliating experience of my life, an experience that would ultimately lead to the most satisfying moment of vindication I'd ever experienced. But that confrontation was still months away, and first, I had to navigate the treacherous waters of wedding planning with a woman who was about to make my life a living hell. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The story of how I came to own Grandview Estate begins in the ashes of my marriage, during the most vulnerable period of my entire life. It was 2011. And I was sitting in my divorce attorney's office, staring at a settlement. Check for $380,000. Money that Robert had grudgingly agreed to pay, convinced it would be gone within a year due to my supposed financial incompetence. Invest it conservatively, my attorney advised. Treasury bonds, maybe a nice mutual fund. Something safe that will provide steady income. But as I drove home that day, I found myself taking a detour through Millbrook Valley, a winding country road I'd always loved for its peaceful scenery. That's when I saw the for sale sign hanging crookedly on the rusted iron gates of what had once been the grandest estate in the county. Grandview Estate had been abandoned for nearly a decade. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Weatherbys, had died within months of each other, leaving behind a property that their children couldn't afford to maintain. The asking price was $350,000, almost exactly what I had in settlement money. Any rational person would have driven past. The mansion's roof was partially collapsed, the gardens were overgrown with weeds, and the old carriage house where I now live had broken windows and a family of raccoons living in the attic. But something about the place called to me. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon sun still caught the remaining stained glass windows, or the dignity that somehow persisted despite years of neglect. I called the realtor that evening. "I'd like to see the Grandview property," I said. "Ma'am," he replied with barely concealed condescension, "that property requires extensive renovation. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in repairs. It's not really suitable for someone looking for a simple family home." Even then, people were already underestimating me. The next morning, I met him at the estate. As we walked through rooms with peeling wallpaper and floors that creaked ominously under our feet, he kept emphasizing the problems. The electrical system needed complete rewiring. The plumbing was from the 1920s. The heating system was beyond repair, and the structural damage would require expert assessment. "This place will bankrupt you," he said bluntly as we stood in what had once been the grand ballroom. "I've seen too many people get in over their heads with properties like this." But I wasn't looking at the problems. I was seeing the potential. The ballroom's bones were magnificent. 20-foot ceilings with original crown molding, massive windows that would flood the space with natural light once cleaned, and architectural details that modern construction could never replicate. The gardens, despite being overgrown, still showed evidence of their original elegant design. Most importantly, I could see what this place could become. Not just a restored mansion, but a venue where people would create their most important memories. "I'll take it," I said, surprising both of us. Robert's reaction was exactly what I'd expected. "Have you lost your mind?" he screamed over the phone when I told him about the purchase. "That money was supposed to secure your future, not fund some ridiculous fantasy about playing house in a haunted mansion." "It's not haunted," I replied calmly, though I was beginning to understand that Robert's opinion of my judgment was irrelevant to my new life. "You'll be bankrupt within 6 months," he predicted gleefully. "And don't come crying to me when you're living in a cardboard box." Even Sophia, who was 16 at the time, seemed embarrassed by what she saw as my impractical decision. "Mom, why can't you just buy a normal house like everyone else?" she asked during one of our increasingly tense visits. But I had a vision, and more importantly, I had something to prove. Not to Robert or even to Sophia, but to myself. I was 42 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based on my own judgment rather than someone else's expectations. The first year was brutal. I moved into the carriage house, which was barely habitable, and began the overwhelming task of restoration. I couldn't afford contractors for everything, so I learned to do much of the work myself. I spent countless hours on YouTube, learning how to strip wallpaper, sand floors, and repair plaster. My hands were constantly covered in cuts and bruises, and I fell asleep every night exhausted and aching. During the day, I worked as a freelance event coordinator, building a client base while simultaneously renovating the estate. I took on weddings, corporate retreats, and private parties, slowly, building a reputation for creating magical experiences on modest budgets. Every dollar I earned went back into Grandview. The local community was skeptical at best. "That city woman thinks she can just waltz in here and restore the old Weatherby place," I heard at the grocery store. She has no idea what she's gotten herself into. But I pressed on. Room by room, season by season, Grandview began to transform. I restored the grand staircase's original walnut banister, brought the crystal chandeliers back to their former glory, and redesigned the gardens using historical photographs I'd found in the mansion's library. The breakthrough came in year 3, when I hosted my first wedding at Grandview. The bride was a young teacher named Jennifer, who'd been planning to have her reception in her parents' backyard because she couldn't afford anything else. I offered to host her wedding at cost, just to test whether my vision could work. The photographs from that wedding changed everything. When Jennifer posted them on social media, they went viral in our region. Suddenly, my phone was ringing constantly with inquiries from couples who wanted their own fairy tale wedding at Grandview Estate. But I made a crucial decision. I would operate under the business name Millbrook Valley Events, not my own name. This wasn't about ego or recognition. It was about creating something that would stand on its own merit, free from the baggage of my failed marriage and Robert's continued criticism. By year 5, I had a waiting list. By year 7, I was turning away clients because we were booked solid. By year 10, I had purchased Riverside Manor, a smaller but equally elegant property perfect for intimate gatherings. Throughout this entire journey, I maintained my modest lifestyle. I continued living in the carriage house, driving a reliable but unremarkable car, and wearing simple clothes that wouldn't be damaged by renovation work. To anyone looking from the outside, I appeared to be a woman of modest means who worked in the event planning industry. Robert, meanwhile, had remarried a woman named Patricia who came from old money. They lived in a sprawling suburban mansion, drove luxury cars, and vacationed in Europe twice a year. During Sophia's visits, she would tell me about their lavish lifestyle, comparing it unfavorably to my little cottage and small business. "Dad says you're doing okay for yourself," she'd say with the kind of condescending kindness that cut deeper than outright criticism. "But you really should think about your retirement planning. Patricia says you can't just live hand to mouth forever." I never corrected these assumptions. Part of me enjoyed the irony that Robert's new wife was dispensing financial advice to a woman whose business was worth more than their house. But mostly, I stayed quiet because I'd learned that actions spoke louder than words, and I was building something that would speak for itself when the time was right. That time came when Sophia called about her wedding, unknowingly choosing the very venue I'd spent over a decade perfecting. The daughter who'd been taught to see me as financially incompetent was about to discover that her struggling mother had built something extraordinary. But first, I had to navigate the treacherous waters of wedding planning with Vivian Ashworth, a woman who was about to make the next several months the most challenging of my life. The following week, I called my property manager, Helena Martinez, who had been with me since year 4 of Grandview's transformation. Helena was one of the few people who knew the full scope of what I'd built, and her loyalty had been invaluable as my business expanded beyond what anyone could have imagined. "We need to prepare for the Caldwell-Morrison wedding in May," I told her, using the formal names I'd learned from Sophia's engagement announcement in the local paper. "This one is personal, Helena." "Personal how?" she asked, and I could hear the curiosity in her voice. In 12 years of working together, I'd never described any event as personal. "The bride is my daughter," I said quietly. "And she doesn't." "No, I own Grandview." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Helena had heard plenty about my complicated relationship with Sophia over the years, but this revelation clearly caught her off guard. "Your daughter chose Grandview for her wedding without knowing you own it?" she finally asked. "That's exactly what happened. And Helena, there's more. The groom's mother is apparently very involved in the planning process, and from what Sophia tells me, she has strong opinions about everything. We need to be prepared for some challenging months ahead." What I didn't tell Helena was that I'd spent the past few days researching Vivian Ashworth, and what I'd found was both impressive and intimidating. Vivian was the widow of Charles Ashworth, who had built a telecommunications empire before his death 5 years earlier. She sat on the boards of 3 major charities, was a patron of the Metropolitan Museum, and had been featured in Town and Country magazine as one of the region's most influential socialites. In other words, she was exactly the kind of person who would view someone like me, a divorced woman living in a carriage house, as beneath her notice. The irony, of course, was that my business portfolio was likely worth more than her late husband's estate, but that wasn't information she would ever think to investigate. By the time our first planning meeting arrived, I'd prepared myself for battle, though I expected it to be a subtle war of passive aggression and social positioning. I was not prepared for Vivian Ashworth to declare open warfare from the moment she stepped through Grandview's front doors. She arrived in a chauffeur-driven Bentley, dressed in a cream-colored Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about her presentation screamed old money and social superiority, from her perfectly coiffed silver hair to the family heirloom jewelry that caught the light as she moved. Sophia and Marcus followed in his modest Honda Civic, and the contrast was immediately apparent. While Marcus seemed overwhelmed by his mother's presence, Sophia looked nervous and uncertain. Not the confident young woman I'd raised, but someone trying desperately to measure up to impossible standards. "So this is the famous Grandview Estate," Vivian said, as Helena led our group through the main hall. Her tone was appraising, almost clinical, as if she were evaluating a purchase rather than admiring a venue. "The photographs don't quite capture the rustic charm." I bit my tongue at the subtle insult. Rustic charm. As if 12 years of meticulous historical restoration could be dismissed so casually. "The ballroom is through here," Helena said diplomatically, leading us toward the mansion's crown jewel. I hung back slightly, wanting to observe the dynamics without inserting myself too prominently into the conversation. As we entered the ballroom, I watched Sophia's face light up with genuine wonder. Despite all the years of distance between us, I still knew my daughter well enough to recognize her authentic emotional responses. This was the reaction I'd hoped for. Pure joy at the beauty of the space I'd spent so many years perfecting. "Oh my God," she breathed, turning slowly to take in the restored crystal chandeliers, the gleaming hardwood floors, and the wall of French doors that opened onto the garden terrace. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered from the photos." But before I could savor the moment, Vivian's voice cut through the air like ice. "The chandeliers are rather ostentatious, don't you think? And these floors will be terrible for dancing. Far too slippery. We'll need to arrange for proper flooring to be installed." Helena's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Actually, Mrs. Ashworth, these floors were specifically refinished for dancing. We've hosted over 200 weddings here, and we've never had any safety issues." 200 weddings, Vivian repeated dismissively. "How commercial. I was hoping for something more exclusive." I felt my jaw clench. Commercial. As if creating magical moments for 200 couples was somehow degrading rather than an honor. "What about the garden ceremony space?" Sophia asked quickly, clearly trying to redirect the conversation away from her future mother-in-law's criticism. We moved outside to the ceremony lawn, where I'd spent countless hours designing what I believed was the perfect wedding setting. The space was framed by mature oak trees, with carefully curated flower beds that bloomed in succession throughout the spring and summer seasons. A small gazebo, which I'd built myself during my 3rd year at Grandview, provided an elegant focal point for the ceremony. "This won't work at all," Vivian announced before we'd even reached the center of the lawn. "The trees will block the photographer's sight lines, and the gazebo is far too small for a proper wedding party. We'll need to arrange for a much larger structure, something more substantial." "Mom," Marcus said quietly, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived, "maybe we should discuss these changes privately before—" "There's nothing to discuss. Privately," Vivian interrupted. These are obvious improvements that any experienced event planner would recognize immediately. She turned to Helena with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I assume the venue management will be accommodating regarding these necessary modifications? Helena glanced at me almost imperceptibly before responding. Any significant structural changes would need to be approved by the property owner. Then arrange a meeting with the owner, Vivian said briskly. I'm sure they'll be reasonable once they understand the caliber of event we're planning. What Vivian didn't know was that she was speaking to representatives of that owner. Helena, who managed my properties, and me, who had built this entire business from nothing. The owner she was so casually demanding to meet was standing 3 feet away from her, listening to every dismissive comment and condescending suggestion. But I wasn't ready to reveal that truth yet. Something about Vivian's automatic assumption that she could reshape Grandview to suit her preferences, regardless of its historical significance or existing beauty, told me that this was going to be a much larger battle than I'd anticipated. Over the next 2 hours, Vivian systematically criticized nearly every aspect of Grandview that I was most proud of. The dining room was too intimate for a proper reception. The bridal suite needed significant updating to meet modern standards. The catering kitchen, which had been professionally designed and equipped to handle events for up to 300 guests, was obviously inadequate for the kind of sophisticated menu she had in mind. With each criticism, I watched Sophia grow smaller and quieter. The young woman who had called me with such excitement about her wedding was disappearing before my eyes, replaced by someone desperately trying to please a woman who seemed determined to find fault with everything. By the time we concluded the tour, I realized that Vivian Ashworth wasn't just difficult. She was dangerous. Dangerous to my daughter's happiness, dangerous to the vision Sophia had for her own wedding, and potentially dangerous to the business I'd spent over a decade building. As they prepared to leave, Vivian handed Helena an elegant business card. "Have the owner contact me directly," she instructed. "It's clear that significant modifications will be necessary, and I prefer to handle these matters at the decision-making level." The decision-making level. As if Helena and I were merely hired help, incapable of understanding the sophisticated requirements of Vivian Ashworth's social circle. After they left, Helena and I stood in the empty ballroom, surrounded by the beauty that Vivian had spent the afternoon dismissing. "She has no idea who she's dealing with, does she?" Helena asked quietly. "None whatsoever," I replied. "And I'm beginning to think that's going to be a problem for all of us." What I didn't know then was that Vivian's criticisms were just the opening salvo in what would become the most challenging battle of my life, a battle that would ultimately force me to choose between my daughter's happiness and my own dignity over. The following weeks, what should have been joyful wedding planning sessions became psychological warfare, with Vivian Ashworth as the commanding general and my daughter as the primary casualty. Every meeting at Grandview felt like a hostile takeover attempt, with Vivian systematically dismantling years of careful restoration work through sheer force of will and social positioning. The second planning meeting set the tone for everything that would follow. Vivian arrived with a leather portfolio thick with magazine clippings, Pinterest printouts, and what appeared to be a military-style planning document complete with timelines and vendor assignments. She'd also brought reinforcements, her personal assistant Caroline, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who took notes on everything and spoke in the clipped, efficient tones of someone accustomed to executing orders without question. "I've taken the liberty of researching appropriate florists," Vivian announced, spreading glossy brochures across Helena's carefully prepared presentation materials. "Sophia mentioned wanting garden roses, but obviously we'll need something more sophisticated. I'm thinking imported orchids from Thailand, arranged by Pemberton and Associates. They handle all the high-profile events in the city." Sophia looked confused. "But Mom, I never said I wanted garden roses. I actually love the idea of using flowers from Grandview's own gardens. Remember how beautiful they looked in the photos?" "Darling," Vivian replied with the kind of patronizing smile that made my teeth ache, Estate gardens are charming for everyday purposes, but a wedding of this caliber requires professional-grade arrangements. You'll understand when you're older. When you're older. Sophia was 27 years old, a successful marketing manager with her own apartment and career. But Vivian spoke to her as if she were a child playing dress-up. Helena cleared her throat diplomatically. Actually, our garden roses are heritage varieties, some over 50 years old. They're quite remarkable, and many couples specifically choose Grandview because of the estate-grown flowers. Vivian's smile never wavered, but her eyes turned glacial. I'm sure they're lovely for couples with more modest expectations. However, the guest list for this wedding will include some very prominent people who are accustomed to a certain standard. The guest list. This was the first I'd heard about prominent guests, and judging by the surprise on Sophia's face, it was news to her as well. What guest list? Sophia asked hesitantly. Caroline opened a separate folder with the efficiency of a seasoned campaign manager. Mrs. Ashworth has compiled a preliminary list of essential invitations. Business associates of the late Mr. Ashworth, board members from the various foundations, family friends from the club. She handed Sophia a typed document that appeared to be several pages long. As my daughter scanned the list, her face grew progressively paler. Vivian, this is over 200 people, Sophia said quietly. Marcus and I were thinking of something smaller, maybe 80 guests total. Nonsense, Vivian replied briskly. A wedding is about celebrating the joining of two families, and the Ashworth family has certain social obligations. These people have included us in their celebrations for years. It would be unconscionably rude not to reciprocate. I watched my daughter struggle with this information, clearly torn between her own vision for her wedding and the pressure to accommodate her future mother-in-law's social requirements. Marcus, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. Mother, maybe we could discuss this privately. Sophia and I should have some input into our own guest list. Vivian turned to her son with the kind of disappointed expression that had probably been perfecting Marcus's compliance since childhood. Marcus, darling, you're thinking like a child. This wedding isn't just about your personal preferences. It's about representing the family properly. When you inherit your father's business interests, these relationships will be crucial to your success. The manipulation was so smooth, so expertly delivered, that I almost admired its effectiveness even as it made me sick. Vivian had just reminded her son that his financial future depended on maintaining these social connections, and that defying her wishes about the wedding would be tantamount to sabotaging his own career prospects. Now, Vivian continued, turning back to Helena with renewed authority, let's discuss the catering situation. I've been in touch with Laurent and Fils, the French catering company that handles events for the governor's mansion. They'll need exclusive access to the kitchen for 3 days prior to the wedding to properly prepare their signature dishes. Helena's professional composure cracked slightly. Mrs. Ashworth, Grandview has an exclusive partnership with Riverside Catering. They've been providing exceptional service here for 8 years, and they're intimately familiar with the kitchen facilities and the estate's requirements. I'm sure they're adequate for typical events, Vivian said dismissively. But this occasion requires something more distinguished. Laurent and Fils has catered events for foreign dignitaries and A-list celebrities. Their reputation is impeccable. What Vivian didn't know was that Riverside Catering was owned by James Mitchell, a classically trained chef who had worked in Michelin-starred restaurants before deciding to focus on boutique event catering. His food was exceptional, his presentation was flawless, and his understanding of Grandview's capabilities was unmatched. More importantly, James had become a friend over the years, someone who understood my vision for creating perfect wedding experiences. But I could see that none of this mattered to Vivian. She wasn't interested in quality or compatibility. She was interested in names and prestige, in being able to tell her social circle that she'd hired the same caterer used by governors and celebrities. The meeting continued for another hour, with Vivian systematically replacing every aspect of Grandview's carefully developed vendor relationships with her own preferred alternatives. The photographer who had captured hundreds of beautiful weddings at the estate wasn't sophisticated enough. She wanted someone who had shot fashion spreads for Vogue. The string quartet that knew every acoustic quirk of the ballroom wasn't prestigious enough. She preferred the symphony musicians who performed at charity galas. With each substitution, I watched Sophia retreat further into herself. The confident young woman who had called me with such excitement about her engagement was being systematically erased, replaced by someone who nodded along with whatever Vivian suggested, afraid to voice her own preferences for fear of being dismissed as naive or unsophisticated. The breaking point came when Vivian announced her plans for the ceremony itself. "Obviously, we'll need to bring in a proper altar," she said, consulting her notes. "Something substantial and elegant. The little gazebo is far too rustic for a formal ceremony." "The gazebo has special meaning for us," Sophia said quietly, speaking up for the first time in 20 minutes. "It's where Marcus proposed. We specifically chose Grandview because I fell in love with that spot." Vivian's expression didn't change, but I saw something calculating flicker in her eyes. "How romantic," she said, in a tone that managed to be both indulgent and condescending. "But darling, you need to think about your wedding photographs. That little structure will look terribly amateurish in the formal shots that you'll treasure for the rest of your life. Trust me, you'll thank me later for insisting on something more appropriate." I felt something crack inside my chest. The gazebo wasn't just a pretty garden structure. It was something I had built with my own hands during the 3rd year of Grandview's restoration. I'd designed it to complement the estate's architecture while providing the perfect focal point for wedding ceremonies. Dozens of couples had exchanged vows there, and their photographers had consistently praised its photogenic qualities and romantic atmosphere. But more than that, it represented everything I'd worked for: the vision, the craftsmanship, and the attention to detail that had transformed Grandview from a crumbling ruin into a magical venue. To dismiss it as terribly amateurish was to dismiss everything I'd accomplished. As the meeting finally concluded and our guests prepared to leave, Vivian handed Helena another business card, this one embossed with gold lettering. "This is my event coordinator, Beatrice Wellington," she said. "She'll be taking over the primary planning responsibilities from this point forward." Beatrice has managed weddings for 3 senators' daughters and a Supreme Court justice's son. She understands the level of sophistication required for an event of this magnitude. Helena accepted the card without comment, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. We'd been dismissed, relegated to the role of venue staff expected to execute someone else's vision, rather than partners in creating a memorable celebration. After they left, Helena and I stood in the garden, looking at the gazebo that had been deemed inadequate by a woman who had never created anything more lasting than a seating chart. "She's going to destroy everything special about this place," Helena said quietly. "She's going to try," I replied. "But she doesn't know who she's really dealing with yet." What I didn't say was that I was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about wedding planning anymore. This was about power, control, and the systematic destruction of my daughter's autonomy. Vivian Ashworth had declared war on everything I'd built, and she was using my own daughter as a weapon against me. The question was, how long could I watch Sophia disappear before I fought back? The final planning dinner was held at the exclusive Thornfield Country Club, Vivian's preferred venue for serious discussions. I should have recognized the trap the moment I received the formal invitation on cream-colored cardstock with gold-embossed lettering. Everything about the evening was designed to remind me of my supposed place in their social hierarchy. The club itself was a monument to old money and older prejudices, with oil paintings of long-dead patriarchs lining the mahogany-paneled walls, and Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's cars. I arrived in my reliable Honda Accord, parking between a Mercedes and a BMW in the circular drive. immediately aware that I was stepping into foreign territory. Vivian had reserved the club's private dining room, a space that reeked of privilege and exclusion. Marcus's father, William Ashworth Jr., had flown in from his business meetings in London specifically for this dinner, a detail that Vivian mentioned 3 times within the first 10 minutes, as if his presence somehow elevated the occasion to historic significance. William was a younger, more polished version of the entitled businessman archetype. Perfectly groomed silver hair, a suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and the kind of confident bearing that comes from never having been told no about anything that truly mattered to him. "So you're Sophia's mother," he said when Vivian introduced us, extending a hand with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to working rooms full of potential business partners. "Vivian tells me you've been quite helpful with the venue arrangements. Quite helpful, as if I were a wedding planner they'd hired rather than the mother of the bride." Sophia arrived 20 minutes late, looking harried and apologetic in a way that immediately set my teeth on edge. My confident, successful daughter had been replaced by someone who seemed perpetually anxious about meeting other people's expectations. Sorry, she said, sliding into the chair beside me. Traffic was terrible, and then I couldn't find parking. "No matter, darling," Vivian said smoothly. "We were just discussing the final details for next month's celebration." The waiter appeared immediately, the kind of invisible efficiency that expensive establishments pride themselves on. As we examined menus with no prices listed, I realized that this entire evening was choreographed to demonstrate the vast difference between their world and mine. "I took the liberty of ordering wine for the table," William announced, gesturing to the sommelier who appeared with a bottle that I recognized as costing several $100s, a 2015 Bordeaux that I've been saving for a special occasion. The conversation during dinner was a masterclass in social manipulation. William regaled us with stories of his recent business trip, casually mentioning meetings with European executives and government officials. Vivian contributed anecdotes about charity fundraisers and museum galas, each story designed to highlight her connections with governors, senators, and cultural elite. Throughout it all, Sophia grew quieter and smaller, clearly intimidated by the level of wealth and influence casually displayed around the table. This wasn't the daughter I'd raised, the young woman who had once passionately argued politics with her college professors and defended her opinions with fierce intelligence. This was someone who had been systematically diminished until she believed she belonged on the margins of these conversations. "Which brings us to the final guest list," Vivian said as dessert was served, producing yet another leather folder from her seemingly inexhaustible supply of organizational materials. "We've finalized the invitations at 237 guests." Sophia's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. 237? "But we talked about keeping it smaller." "Darling," William interrupted with practiced patience, "when you're joining a family with certain social obligations, you learn to balance personal preferences with practical necessities. These relationships matter for Marcus's future career prospects." "What about my career?" Sophia asked quietly, surprising everyone, including herself. "What about what Marcus and I actually want for our wedding?" Vivian's smile became strained around the edges. "Sophia, sweetheart, I understand that planning a wedding can feel overwhelming. That's why Beatrice has taken over most of the complicated details. All you need to do is show up and look beautiful. All you need to do is show up." The dismissal was so casual, so complete, that I felt something cold and sharp twist in my stomach. "Speaking of showing up," William said, reaching for his own folder, "there are a few logistical matters we need to address." He pulled out what appeared to be a formal document, sliding it across the table toward me with the confidence of someone announcing a business merger. "What's this?" I asked, though something in his expression already told me I wasn't going to like the answer. "Revised arrangements for the wedding day," Vivian explained, her voice taking on the tone she'd probably perfected during years of charitable board meetings. "We've had to make some difficult decisions about the guest capacity and seating arrangements." I opened the folder and felt the world tilt sideways. Inside was a detailed seating chart, a timeline for the day's events, and a guest list with my name conspicuously absent from every single document. In the margin of the seating chart, someone had written in elegant handwriting, "Mother of bride. Financial contribution acknowledged. Attendance not required." The silence at our table stretched for what felt like an eternity while I processed what I was seeing. Around us, the quiet conversations of other diners continued, the gentle clink of expensive crystal and silverware providing an obscene soundtrack to my humiliation. "There's been some mistake," I said finally, my voice sounding distant and hollow, to my own ears. "I'm afraid there hasn't," William replied, his tone gentle but implacable. "You see, we've had to be quite strategic about the guest list. Between Marcus's business associates, the family friends, and Vivian's charitable connections, space has become extremely limited." "Limited," I repeated, staring at the document that reduced me to a footnote in my own daughter's wedding. "It's complicated, Mom," Sophia said quietly, still not meeting my eyes. "With Dad and Patricia coming, and all of Marcus's family, and the business connections, Vivian thought it might be easier if we kept the actual ceremony to immediate family only." Immediate family. Apparently, the woman who had given birth to the bride, raised her, and was paying for the venue didn't qualify as immediate family. "We certainly appreciate your generous contribution to the venue costs," Vivian added, as if mentioning my financial involvement somehow softened the blow of my exclusion. "It's been quite helpful in managing the overall budget." I looked around the table at these people who had calmly, systematically planned to exclude me from one of the most important days of my daughter's life. William continued cutting his creme brulee with surgical precision. Vivian sipped her wine as if we were discussing flower arrangements rather than my banishment. Marcus stared at his plate, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge his parents. And Sophia, my daughter, whom I had defended against her father's criticism, supported through college, and tried to help achieve her dream wedding, refused to meet my eyes. "I see," I said, closing the folder and placing it carefully on the table beside my untouched dessert. "And this decision was made by whom exactly?" "We all discussed it," Vivian said smoothly. "It seemed like the most practical solution for everyone involved. Everyone except me, apparently. The accusation hung in the air, and for the first time all evening, genuine discomfort flickered across William's face. But it was Vivian who recovered first, leaning forward with the kind of concerned expression that politicians perfect for difficult press conferences. "Please understand, this isn't personal," she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "We simply want to ensure that Sophia's special day proceeds smoothly, without any potential complications or awkward moments. Potential complications. Awkward moments." They were talking about me as if I were a liability to be managed rather than the mother of the bride. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. Every eye in the private dining room was now focused on our table, drawn by the tension that had finally become too obvious to ignore. "Sophia," I said quietly, giving my daughter one last opportunity to find her voice, to stand up for me the way I had spent years standing up for her. She looked up then, and I saw tears in her eyes. But also resignation. She'd already made her choice, and it wasn't me. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. It's complicated. Complicated. 27 years of motherhood reduced to complicated." I picked up my purse, maintaining what dignity I could manage, while my world crumbled around me. "Well then," I said, my voice remarkably steady given the earthquake happening inside my chest. "I suppose there's nothing left to discuss." As I walked toward the dining room door, I heard Vivian's voice behind. Me, already moving on to practical matters. Now, about the rehearsal dinner arrangements. I made it all the way to my car before the tears started, sitting in the country club parking lot surrounded by luxury vehicles that cost more than some people's houses, crying for the daughter I'd apparently lost and the relationship that had been systematically poisoned by people who viewed love as a strategic resource to be allocated according to social advantage. But as I drove home through the quiet streets toward Grandview Estate, toward the property they'd dismissed me from, while simultaneously using for their grand social event, something else began to burn through the hurt and humiliation. Anger. Pure, clean, righteous anger. They wanted to exclude me from my daughter's wedding while using my venue for their social climbing exhibition. They wanted to treat me like hired help while benefiting from my generosity. We'd see about that. It was time for Vivian Ashworth and her entitled family to learn exactly who they'd been underestimating all these months. The morning after the devastating dinner at Thornfield Country Club, I woke before dawn with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The hurt was still there, a constant ache in my chest, but it had crystallized into something far more useful. Determination. If Vivian Ashworth wanted to play games with my daughter's wedding while using my property as her stage, she was about to discover that she'd chosen the wrong opponent. I made coffee in the pre-dawn darkness of my carriage house kitchen and called Helena before 7 a.m. She answered on the second ring, already awake and clearly expecting my call. "I heard about last night," she said without preamble. "Marcus called here around 11 p.m. sounding panicked. He wanted to know if there was any way to reverse or modify the booking arrangements." "What did you tell him?" "That all contract modifications had to be approved by the property owner," Helena replied, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in her voice. He asked who that was, and I told him the owner preferred to handle all communications through designated representatives. I smiled for the first time in 24 hours. Helena had been executing our standard protocols, but in this context, those protocols had become weapons. Good. What else did he say? He seemed genuinely distressed about the situation with you being excluded. I got the impression he wasn't fully aware of what his mother and father had planned until it happened at dinner. This information gave me pause. Throughout the months of wedding planning, Marcus had seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his mother's takeover tactics, but he'd never directly challenged her. If he was calling Helena in a panic, perhaps there was more complexity to his position than I'd realized. Did he ask for any specific changes? He wanted to know about adding you back to all the events, but when I explained that the booking contract was with Lancaster Holdings rather than individual family members, he got confused. He asked who Lancaster Holdings was. Lancaster Holdings was the parent company I'd created for all my property investments, another layer of separation between my personal identity and my business success. Very few people knew that I was the sole owner of Lancaster Holdings, which owned Millbrook Valley Events, which operated Grandview Estate. Let him stay confused for now, I decided. But Helena, I need you to help me with something. It's time to remind everyone involved exactly who holds the power in this situation. Over the next hour, Helena and I crafted a strategy that was both professionally appropriate and personally satisfying. Every communication would be technically correct, legally sound, and utterly infuriating to people accustomed to getting their way through social pressure and financial influence. The first move came at 10 a.m. sharp, when Helena sent a formal email to Beatrice Wellington, Vivian's imported event coordinator. "Dear Ms. Wellington," the email began, "we have received your detailed event modifications for the Caldwell-Morrison wedding scheduled for May 15th. After careful review, several of your proposed changes require direct approval from the property owner before implementation can proceed. These include structural modifications to the ceremony site, exclusive kitchen access for outside catering services, replacement of estate-preferred vendors with outside contractors, and alterations to the historical garden landscaping. Please be advised that all such requests must be submitted through proper channels for ownership review. Additionally, We note that the current booking agreement does not include authorization for the extensive guest list expansion you've outlined. Properties owned by Lancaster Holdings maintain strict capacity limits for safety and environmental preservation reasons. We await your revised proposals that comply with existing guidelines. Best regards, Helena Martinez, Property Management Director. The response came within 30 minutes, and Helena forwarded it to me with a note that simply said, "Brace yourself." Beatrice Wellington had clearly never been told no in her professional life. Her reply was a masterpiece of indignant entitlement, demanding immediate contact with whoever is actually in charge, and threatening to take this matter up with appropriate authorities if her reasonable requests weren't accommodated immediately. She mentions that Mrs. Ashworth's family has significant influence in local government and business communities, Helena noted when she called me after receiving the email. "I think she's trying to intimidate us." "Let her try," I replied. "Send her the standard form for requesting owner consultation. Make sure she understands that all requests must be submitted in writing with detailed justifications." The standard form was a document I'd created years earlier to handle unreasonable client demands. It required extensive documentation, multiple signatures, and a processing fee that was specifically designed to discourage frivolous requests. Most clients backed down when faced with actual bureaucratic procedures, but Vivienne Ashworth was not most clients. By noon, my phone was ringing with calls from Marcus, each one more desperate than the last. Helena had been screening my calls all morning, following my instructions to redirect any family communications through proper channels. "Mom," Marcus said when Helena finally patched him through to me, "there's been some kind of misunderstanding with the venue management. They're saying all these changes need special approval, and they won't tell us who to contact for that approval." "That does sound complicated," I replied, keeping my tone neutral and professional. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" "Everything," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "The catering, the flowers, the ceremony setup. Apparently, none of it can be done the way my mother wants without something called ownership authorization." "Well, that makes sense," I said reasonably. "Grandview is a historically significant property. I imagine they have strict preservation guidelines." "But this is our wedding," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. "Surely they can make exceptions for special circumstances." "Have you tried explaining the situation to the property management company?" "They keep referring us to forms and procedures. And Mom is furious. She's threatening to find a different venue entirely. This was exactly what I'd been hoping to hear." "That might be for the best," I said carefully. "If Grandview's policies don't align with your family's expectations, perhaps a more flexible venue would be better for everyone." "No," Marcus said quickly. "Sophie would be heartbroken if we changed venues. She's had her heart set on Grandview since the beginning. There has to be some way to work this out." "Have you asked Sophia what she thinks about all these proposed changes?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to understand that Marcus hadn't consulted his fiancée about any of the modifications his mother was demanding. "She's been letting my mother handle most of the planning details," he finally admitted. "Sophie's been so busy with work, and my mother has experience with these kinds of events." "I see," I said, and I truly did see, perhaps more clearly than Marcus realized. "Well, I'm sure the venue management will work with you to find solutions that meet everyone's needs." After we hung up, I sat in my office overlooking the gardens that Vivienne wanted to modify and felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The satisfaction came from watching entitled people discover that money and social connections didn't automatically override property rights and business policies. The sadness came from realizing how completely my daughter had been marginalized in the planning of her own wedding. The afternoon brought a visit from Beatrice Wellington herself, arriving in a Blacktown car with tinted windows like she was conducting some kind of covert operation. Helena called to warn me, and I watched from my carriage house window as the perfectly dressed event coordinator stalked across the estate grounds with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to intimidating service providers into compliance. "She's demanding to see the owner," Helena texted me. "Should I continue with the protocol?" "Absolutely," I replied. "Follow every procedure exactly as written." For the next 2 hours, I was entertained by the sight of Beatrice Wellington being subjected to the same bureaucratic maze that I'd developed to handle unreasonable client demands. Helena walked her through form after form, explaining policy after policy, requiring signature after signature. By the time Beatrice emerged from the main house, her perfectly styled hair was showing signs of stress, and her designer suit looked wilted. She made 3 phone calls from her car before driving away, and I had no doubt that those calls were to Vivian, William, and possibly the governor himself, if Vivian's claims about her connections were accurate. The evening brought the most interesting development yet: a text message from Sophia. "Mom, can we talk? Something weird is happening with the wedding planning, and I'm getting scared that everything is falling apart." For the first time since the disastrous dinner at Thornfield, my daughter was reaching out to me directly, not as a last resort or an afterthought, but because she needed her mother. I called her immediately. "Sophie, what's wrong?" "Everything," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Vivienne is furious about something with the venue, and she's talking about canceling the whole wedding. Marcus is panicking, and his father is making phone calls to people about handling this situation. I don't understand what's happening, but I'm afraid they're going to ruin everything." "Tell me exactly what you know," I said gently. As Sophia explained the chaos from her perspective, the mysterious venue complications, the family arguments, the threats to find a different location, I realized that she had no idea her exclusion from the wedding had triggered this entire crisis. She'd been so marginalized from the planning process that she didn't even understand the connection between her family's decision to exclude me and the venue's sudden inflexibility. "Mom," she said finally, "I need your help. You know people in the event planning industry. Is there anything you can do to fix this?" The irony was so perfect it was almost poetic. My daughter, who had allowed her future in-laws to exclude me from her wedding, was now asking me to save that same wedding from the consequences of their own arrogance. "I'll see what I can do," I promised. But what I didn't tell her was that I already knew exactly how to fix everything, and that the solution would require everyone involved to finally acknowledge who they'd really been dealing with all along. 3. Days after Sophia's tearful phone call, Helena called me with news that made my pulse quicken with anticipation. "They're coming," she said without preamble. "All of them. Vivian called this morning demanding an emergency meeting with whoever is actually running this operation. She's bringing William, Marcus, and Sophia. They'll be here at 2 o'clock. I glanced at my watch. It was barely 9 a.m., which meant I had 5 hours to prepare for what would undoubtedly be the most important confrontation of my life. 5 hours to ready myself for the moment when the carefully constructed walls between my private identity and my business success would finally come crashing down. Did she say anything else? She mentioned bringing her attorney. Helena replied with what sounded like barely contained amusement. "Apparently, she's prepared to pursue all available legal remedies if we don't accommodate her requirements immediately." Her attorney. I almost laughed out loud. After 12 years of building a business that operated with meticulous attention to legal details, insurance requirements, and regulatory compliance, Vivian thought she could intimidate me with legal threats. If she'd done even basic research into Lancaster Holdings, she would have discovered that we'd never lost a legal challenge, never violated a contract, and never failed to meet our obligations to clients. But then again, people like Vivian Ashworth rarely did their own research. They were accustomed to having others handle such tedious details while they focused on the more important work of being impressive. "Helena," I said, decision crystallizing in my mind, "I want you to set up the meeting in the main conference room." Use the good china for refreshments, fresh flowers from the garden, the whole presentation. If Vivian wants to meet the owner, she's going to get the full Grandview experience. Should I prepare any specific documentation? Everything. Property deeds, business licenses, vendor contracts, insurance policies, the complete renovation portfolio with before and after photographs. I want 12 years of proof laid out like evidence in a courtroom. After hanging up with Helena, I walked through the estate grounds one final time as the anonymous owner, taking in details that I'd watched transform from decay to beauty through years of careful work. The morning light filtering through the oak trees, the perfectly manicured gardens that Vivian had dismissed as inadequate, the gazebo that she'd deemed too rustic. All of it represented not just financial investment, but pieces of my heart that I'd built into this place. By noon, I was as ready as I would ever be. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. A tailored navy suit that was professional without being flashy, understated jewelry that suggested success without ostentation, and the kind of confident posture that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you've accomplished. Helena had outdone herself with the conference room presentation. The long mahogany table gleamed under the crystal chandelier, surrounded by leather chairs that had been restored to match the room's original Victorian elegance. Fresh white roses from our own gardens filled crystal vases, and the afternoon light streaming through tall windows created an atmosphere that was both welcoming and imposing. The documentation was arranged with military precision: property portfolios, financial statements, awards from the hospitality industry, letters of recommendation from satisfied clients, and photographs chronicling Grandview's transformation from ruin to premier wedding destination. It was 12 years of hard work laid out like a conquering army's battle standards. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard the crunch of gravel announcing their arrival. From the conference room windows, I watched a small convoy approach, Vivian's chauffeur-driven Bentley followed by William's silver Mercedes, with Marcus and Sophia bringing up the rear in his modest Honda. The contrast in vehicles perfectly illustrated the power dynamics that had shaped every interaction since this nightmare began. Vivian emerged from her car like a general preparing for battle, dressed in an ice blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She was followed by a thin man in an expensive suit who could only be the threatened attorney, someone who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate law firm's promotional materials. William appeared equally prepared for war, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that comes from decades of getting exactly what you want through a combination of money, influence, and intimidation. But it was Sophia who broke my heart. My daughter looked small and fragile, walking several steps behind the others as if she wasn't sure she belonged in this confrontation at all. The confident young woman I'd raised had been so thoroughly diminished by months of manipulation that she looked like a child being dragged to a parent-teacher conference. Helena met them at the front entrance with perfect professional courtesy, leading them through the main foyer toward the conference room. I positioned myself with my back to the door, studying the garden view through the tall windows, allowing them to enter and settle before I revealed myself. "Ladies and gentlemen," I heard Helena say, "thank you for coming today. I know you've been eager to resolve the concerns about your event requirements. Where is the owner?" Vivian's voice cut through the pleasantries like a blade. "We were promised a meeting with whoever is actually in charge of this property. The owner will be with you momentarily," Helena replied smoothly. "In the meantime, perhaps you'd like to review some information about the estate's history and policies." I heard the rustle of papers and the scraping of chairs as they examined the documentation that Helena had prepared. The silence stretched, long enough for them to absorb at least some of what they were seeing. The scale of the operation, the value of the properties, the level of success that Lancaster Holdings had achieved. "This is quite impressive," I heard the attorney murmur, presumably to Vivian. "The company appears to be substantially more significant than we'd understood." I don't care how impressive their portfolio is, Vivian replied sharply. We have a contract, and they need to honor our requirements or face the consequences. Actually, Helena interjected with professional precision, if you review page 3 of your booking agreement, you'll notice that all modifications to the standard service package require owner approval. The items you've requested fall well outside the scope of our typical offerings. Then get us the owner, William said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had probably worked in countless business meetings. We'll resolve this directly. Of course, Helena replied. She's been looking forward to meeting you. I heard the sharp intake of breath from Vivian, the confused murmur from William, and what sounded like a quiet, "Oh no," from Marcus. Only Sophia remained silent, but I could imagine her growing confusion as she processed Helena's pronoun choice. I should mention, Helena continued conversationally, that the owner has been personally involved in every aspect of Grandview's restoration and operation. This property is her life's work, so she takes any proposed modifications quite seriously. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and turned around to face the people who had spent months dismissing me as irrelevant, while simultaneously planning to use my life's work as the backdrop for their social theater. Good afternoon, I said, my voice calm and clear despite the earthquake of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I understand you wanted to meet with the owner of Grandview Estate. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the antique clock on the mantelpiece ticking away the seconds. 4 faces stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to dawning horror. Vivian's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound emerged. William's confident posture crumbled as if someone had cut his puppet strings. The attorney looked frantically between his clients and me, clearly trying to process this unexpected development. But it was Sophia's face that held my attention. My daughter stared at me with eyes wide with recognition and growing understanding, her expression cycling through confusion, realization, and what might have been the beginning of shame. That's impossible, Vivian finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I moved to the head of the conference table, to the chair that had been waiting for me all along, and sat down with the calm authority of someone who belonged exactly where she was. I'm afraid it's not only possible, I replied, gesturing to the documentation spread across the table. It's been true for the past 12 years. Now, I believe you had some concerns about your daughter's wedding arrangements? The silence stretched. For what felt like an eternity, each person at the table processing the revelation in their own way. I watched their faces carefully, noting every micro-expression, every shift in posture as the full weight of what they'd discovered settled over them. Vivian was the first to recover, though her composure was clearly hanging by a thread. This is some kind of elaborate joke, she said, her voice strained but attempting to maintain its usual authority. You're a divorced woman living in a cottage. You can't possibly own all of this. Without breaking eye contact, I reached for the leather portfolio Helena had prepared and opened it to the first page. Certificate of Ownership for Grandview Estate, purchased October 2011 for $350,000, I said, sliding the document across the table. Deed of Ownership for Riverside Manor, purchased 2018 for $1.2 million. Blackwood Inn Acquisition 2020, $800,000. All properties held under Lancaster Holdings, which I established in 2012. William leaned forward to examine the documents, his face growing paler with each page he turned. These appear to be legitimate, he said to Vivian, his voice hollow with disbelief. Of course they're legitimate, I replied evenly. I don't operate my business with fraudulent documentation, Mr. Ashworth. Unlike some people, I prefer to build my reputation on actual accomplishments rather than inherited wealth. The barb hit its mark. William's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sophia hadn't spoken since I'd revealed myself, but I could see her mind working frantically, trying to reconcile the mother she thought she knew with the woman sitting at the head of this opulent conference table. When she finally found her voice, it was barely audible. "Mom, I don't understand. Dad always said you were struggling financially. You live in that little cottage? You drive that old car?" "That little cottage is actually the estate's renovated carriage house," I explained gently. "I chose to live there because it's beautiful, historically significant, and perfectly suited to my needs. As for the car, it's reliable and practical for someone who spends her days managing construction, projects, and meeting with vendors. I've never seen the point in ostentatious displays of wealth." I gestured toward the windows overlooking the gardens. "Everything you see here, every restored room, every landscaped garden, every modernized system while maintaining historical integrity. I built this with my own hands and my own vision. The settlement money from my divorce was just the beginning. Everything else came from hard work, smart investments, and a refusal to accept other people's limitations on what I could achieve." The attorney cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Caldwell, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about your core circumstances. Perhaps we could discuss a reasonable accommodation for the wedding requirements." "Oh, now you want to discuss reasonable accommodations?" I asked, allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. "How interesting that your definition of reasonable has suddenly changed now that you know who you're dealing with." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gazebo that Vivian had dismissed as inadequate. "For months, you've systematically criticized every aspect of this property that I'm most proud of. You've dismissed my carefully chosen vendors, demanded changes to historical features that took years to restore, and treated my staff as if they were incompetent service providers rather than skilled professionals." Turning back to face them, I continued, "But most importantly, you made a decision to exclude me from my own daughter's wedding while simultaneously using my property as the venue for your social showcase. You reduced me to a footnote in my own daughter's life, financial contribution acknowledged, attendance not required." Vivian's face flushed red. "That was a practical decision based on space limitations." "Space limitations?" I interrupted, my voice rising slightly. "Mrs. Ashworth, this estate can comfortably accommodate 500 guests. Your list of 237 would barely fill half the ballroom. The space limitation was your own prejudice, not my property's capacity." Marcus, who had been silent throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke up. "This changes everything," he said, looking helplessly between his mother and me. "If we'd known who you were, if you'd known I was successful, you would have treated me differently?" I asked, genuinely curious about his response. My worth as a person, as Sophia's mother, was contingent on my bank account balance. "That's not what I meant," Marcus backtracked quickly, but we both knew it was exactly what he'd meant. "Actually, it is precisely what you meant," I said, returning to my seat at the head of the table. "For months, you've all operated under the assumption that I was somehow beneath your notice because I didn't display wealth in the ways you expected. You allowed your mother to systematically exclude me from wedding planning, dismiss my opinions, and ultimately ban me from the ceremony itself, all because you believed I was financially dependent and socially irrelevant." I opened another folder, from Helena's presentation. "This is a partial list of the weddings I've hosted here over the past 5 years. 3 governors' children, 2 senators' daughters, a Supreme Court justice's son, and countless other families who understood that true elegance comes from attention to detail and respect for history, not from imported orchids and gold-plated everything." Vivian grabbed the list, scanning it with growing horror. "These are some of the most prominent families in the country," she whispered. "Yes, they are. And they all chose Grandview because they appreciated what I've built here, not because they wanted to tear it down and rebuild it according to their personal preferences." The attorney was frantically taking notes, clearly trying to find some legal angle to salvage the situation. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm sure we can reach an accommodation that satisfies everyone's concerns." "Can we?" I asked, genuinely interested in his response. Because I'm not sure you understand what my concerns actually are. This isn't about money or contracts or legal obligations. This is about the systematic emotional abuse of my daughter and the complete disrespect for everything I've built. I looked directly at Sophia, who was staring at her hands folded in her lap. Sophie, do you remember what you told me when you first called about Grandview? You said this place meant everything to you. You fell in love with the gardens, the ballroom, the gazebo where Marcus proposed. You chose this venue because it represented your dreams for your wedding. She looked up at me then, tears starting to form in her eyes. But over the past months, you've allowed these people to strip away every single element that made this place special to you. The garden flowers you loved became inadequate. The gazebo where you got engaged became too rustic. The intimate atmosphere you wanted became insufficient for proper social requirements. They didn't just plan to exclude me from your wedding. They systematically destroyed your vision for it. Sophie didn't understand the social requirements, Vivienne said defensively. She needed guidance from someone with experience. She needed support from people who loved her, I interrupted. She needed family members who would help her achieve her dreams, not replace them with their own agenda. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. This is the original wedding plan that Sophia and I discussed when she first called me. Small, intimate, focused on the elements of Grandview that she found most beautiful. The total cost would have been about $15,000, including my personal gift of the venue. I slid the folder across to Sophia. Compare that to what you're planning now. A guest list of people you've never met, vendors who don't understand this property, modifications that will damage historical features, and a total cost approaching $100,000. Sophia opened the folder and began reading, her face growing more distressed with each page. This is what I wanted, she said quietly. This is exactly what I described to you. And this is what you could still have, I said gently, if you're willing to remember what actually matters to you. William straightened in his chair, clearly preparing to reassert control over the situation. Now see here, Mrs. Caldwell, we appreciate your revelation, but we still have legitimate concerns about the social aspects of this wedding. Marcus has business relationships to consider. Mr. Ashworth, I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd perfected during 12 years of dealing with difficult clients. Let me be very clear about something. Your son's business relationships are not my concern. Your social obligations are not my concern. Your wife's need to impress her country club friends is definitely not my concern. I stood again, moving to the wall where Helena had hung several framed photographs showing Grandview's transformation from ruin to restoration. My concern is my daughter's happiness, and for the past months, I've watched you systematically destroy that happiness in service of your own social agenda. You've turned what should have been the most joyful period of her life into a source of stress, anxiety, and self-doubt. I turned back to face them. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to decide right now what kind of wedding you actually want. And then you're going to decide whether you want me there to witness my daughter's happiness, or if you prefer to continue with your current plan to exclude me while using my property for your social theater. The room fell silent again. But this time it was a different kind of silence, not shock, but the weight of a decision that everyone knew would define relationships for years to come. Because, I continued, if you choose the latter, I'll be happy to refund your deposit and cancel your booking. There are plenty of other venues that would be delighted to accommodate your specific requirements. But you won't be doing it here, using what I've built, while pretending I don't exist. The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword suspended over the conference table. I could see each person processing the implications of what I'd just said, their faces reflecting the internal calculations happening behind their eyes. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and everyone knew it. Vivienne was the first to attempt damage control. though her usual commanding presence had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Mrs. Caldwell, surely we can discuss this rationally. There's no need for such drastic measures." "Drastic measures?" I repeated, genuinely amused by her choice of words. "Mrs. Ashworth, you spent months planning to exclude me from my own daughter's wedding, while using my property for your event. If anyone has been taking drastic measures, it's been you." William leaned forward, clearly attempting to take charge of the negotiation. "What exactly are you proposing? Some sort of compromise arrangement?" "I'm not proposing anything," I replied calmly. "I'm stating facts. You have a choice to make. Either you want a wedding that honors what Sophia originally envisioned, intimate, beautiful, focused on celebrating love rather than impressing strangers, or you want a social exhibition designed to advance your business interests and satisfy your wife's need for status." I moved back to my chair but remained standing, maintaining the positional authority that came with being the person who actually owned everything around us. "If you choose the first option, I'm happy to work with you to create something magical. We'll return to Sophia's original vision, use the vendors who understand this property, and plan a celebration that focuses on the couple rather than the guest list. And yes, I'll be there to walk my daughter down the aisle and dance at her reception." The attorney started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop him. "If you choose the second option, you have until the end of business today to find another venue. I'll provide a full refund of any deposits paid, outstanding vendor contracts will be canceled, and you can pursue your social agenda somewhere else." "You can't just cancel our wedding contract," Vivian said, her voice rising with desperation. "We have legal obligations, signed agreements." "Actually, we don't," Helena interjected smoothly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. "The booking agreement was contingent on final approval of event details, which was never granted due to the extensive modifications you requested. Legally, we're under no obligation to proceed." The attorney frantically flipped through the documentation, clearly searching for some legal leverage. After several minutes of increasingly frantic page-turning, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "The contract language is quite clear," he admitted to Vivian. "Without final approval of the event specifications, either party can withdraw without penalty." Marcus, who had been growing more agitated throughout the discussion, finally exploded. "This is insane. You're holding our wedding hostage because of hurt feelings." The accusation stung, but I maintained my composure. "Marcus, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about respect, family, and the kind of marriage you and Sophia want to build together." I finally sat down, bringing myself to eye level with everyone else around the table. "Let me ask you something. Do you love Sophia?" "Of course I love her," he replied immediately, clearly offended by the question. "Then why have you spent the past months allowing your mother to systematically erase everything Sophia wanted for her wedding? Why have you stood by while she was excluded from decisions about her own celebration? Why didn't you speak up when your parents decided to exclude her mother from the ceremony?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, clearly struggling to find an answer that didn't make him look weak or complicit. "I was trying to keep peace in the family," he said finally. "My mother has strong opinions, and I thought if I just went along with things, everyone would be happy." "And is Sophia happy?" I asked gently. He looked across the table at his fiancée, who was still staring at the original wedding plans with tears streaming down her face. "No," he admitted quietly. "She's been miserable for months." "Then why are you prioritizing your mother's happiness over your future wife's?" The question hit him like a physical blow. I could see the moment when he truly understood what had been happening, when the pattern of manipulation and control became clear to him for the first time. "I never thought about it that way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, think about it now," I replied. "Because this is the pattern you're establishing for your marriage. Every time there's a conflict between what Sophia wants and what your mother demands, whose side are you going to take? Vivienne, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange, suddenly stood up with renewed determination. This is ridiculous. We're not going to be manipulated by emotional blackmail. No one is manipulating anyone, I said calmly. I'm simply clarifying the situation. You want to use my property for your event, but you don't want me present at that event. That's your choice to make, but it's also my choice whether to accommodate it. We'll find another venue, Vivienne declared, grabbing her purse with theatrical flair. There are plenty of other estates that would be honored to host a wedding of this caliber. I'm sure there are, I agreed, though I should mention that most premium venues book their May dates at least 2 years in advance. You have approximately 3 weeks to find, book, and coordinate a new location for 237 guests. The color drained from Vivienne's face as she realized the practical implications of her dramatic gesture. Also, I continued conversationally, you'll need to notify all the vendors we've already contracted, cancel the catering arrangements, find new florists, photographers, musicians, and coordinate with a completely different staff who won't be familiar with your specific requirements. Helena pulled out her phone and began scrolling through something. I can provide a list of available venues for your date, she offered helpfully, though I should warn you that most of the premier locations are already booked for the spring wedding season. William, who had been calculating furiously in his head, leaned over to whisper something urgent in Vivienne's ear. Whatever he said made her sink back into her chair, her bravado completely deflated. What other venues are available? He asked Helena, his voice resigned. Helena consulted her phone again. For a guest list of over 200 on 3 weeks. Notice? The Riverside Convention Center has availability, though it's not particularly elegant. The downtown hotel ballroom could accommodate your numbers, but it's quite corporate in atmosphere. There's also the community center in Millerville, but that would require bringing in all your own equipment and staff. Each option sounded worse than the last, and I could see Vivienne's social ambitions crumbling with every suggestion. What about smaller, more exclusive venues? William asked desperately. The smaller venues that would meet your aesthetic requirements typically cap their guest lists at 50 to 75 people, Helena replied. You'd need to cut your guest list by more than 2/3. Sophia, who had been silent throughout this practical discussion, suddenly looked up from the original wedding plans. That's exactly what I wanted in the first place, she said, her voice stronger than it had been all afternoon. 50 guests, close family and friends, focused on celebrating rather than impressing people. Sophia, darling, Vivienne began, her tone taking on the patronizing quality I'd learned to despise. You don't understand the social implications. Stop. Sophia interrupted, surprising everyone including herself with the firmness in her voice. Just stop. I'm 27 years old, and I'm tired of being told what I don't understand about my own wedding. She stood up, clutching the original wedding plans to her chest like a shield. Mom was right. This is exactly what I wanted when I first fell in love with Grandview. Small, intimate, beautiful, focused on the things that actually matter. She looked directly at Marcus. Do you remember why we got engaged here? It wasn't because of the social status or the impressive guest list. It was because this place felt magical, like somewhere 2 people could promise to love each other forever. Marcus nodded, his eyes filling with what might have been relief or regret or both. Then that's what we should have, Sophia continued, her confidence growing with each word. Not some elaborate social exhibition, but a real wedding that celebrates what we actually feel for each other. She turned to face me, her expression mixing hope with apprehension. Mom, if we went back to the original plan, small guest list, your preferred vendors, the ceremony and the gazebo, would you be there? For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I smiled with genuine joy. Sophie, there's nothing in the world that would keep me away from celebrating your happiness. The relief on her face was so profound that I had to blink back tears. of my own, but Vivian wasn't finished fighting. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "You're throwing away an opportunity to establish yourselves properly in society. These connections matter for your future." "No," Marcus said, finding his voice at last. "What matters is Sophia's happiness. What matters is starting our marriage by honoring what we both actually want, not what other people think we should want." He reached across the table to take Sophia's hand. "I'm sorry I let things get so out of control. I should have stood up for you months ago." "We can still have a beautiful wedding," Sophia said, looking at the original plans again. "This is what I dreamed of. This is what I fell in love with." I looked around the table at the faces of these people who had spent months underestimating me, dismissing me, and ultimately trying to erase me from my own daughter's life. The power dynamic had shifted completely, but more importantly, my daughter had found her voice again. "So," I said, my tone businesslike but warm, "shall we plan a wedding?" The transformation that followed was nothing short of miraculous. Within hours of Sophia's declaration that she wanted to return to her original vision, the oppressive atmosphere that had dominated months of wedding planning lifted like fog dissipating in morning sunlight. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, my daughter looked genuinely happy. Vivian and William left that afternoon in stony silence, their grand social ambitions crumbling around them like a house of cards. The attorney gathered his unused documents with obvious relief, probably grateful to escape what had become less a legal negotiation than a family intervention. As their cars pulled away from Grandview's circular drive, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Marcus, to his credit, stayed behind to help with the practical aspects of dismantling his mother's elaborate plans. The process was surprisingly cathartic, canceling orders for imported orchids and replacing them with arrangements from Grandview's own gardens, returning the ostentatious altar decorations and scheduling the restoration of my handcrafted gazebo to its original condition, scaling back the guest list from over 200 strangers to 68 people who actually mattered to the couple. "I can't believe I let it get this out of control," Marcus said as we worked through the vendor cancellations. "Sophia tried to tell me she was unhappy, but I kept thinking my mother knew best about these things." "Your mother knows about impressing people," I replied, not unkindly. "But impressing people and creating joy are two very different skills." Helena proved invaluable during the transition, her years of experience allowing her to gracefully extract us from contracts that Vivian had signed without understanding their implications. Several vendors were actually relieved to be released from arrangements that had become increasingly complicated and demanding. "Honestly," said James Mitchell, our preferred caterer, when I called to restore his services, "I was dreading working with that event coordinator. She wanted me to prepare a menu that would have been impossible to execute properly in Grandview's kitchen, and she kept insisting on modifications that would have compromised the quality of everything." The florist we'd originally recommended expressed similar sentiments. Mrs. Ashworth's coordinator kept demanding changes to arrangements that wouldn't have worked with the garden's natural beauty. "I'm much happier creating something that complements what you've built here rather than competing with it." But the most significant transformation was in Sophia herself. As we worked together to recreate her original vision, I watched my confident, decisive daughter emerge from the shadow of intimidation that had defined her for months. The young woman who had once argued politics with college professors and defended her opinions with fierce intelligence was finally returning. "Mom," she said as we sat in the restored gazebo 3 days after the confrontation, "I need to apologize for everything that happened. I let them convince me that you weren't important enough to include in my own wedding, and that's unforgivable. You were being manipulated by experts," I replied gently. "Vivian has probably been practicing those techniques on Marcus for his entire life. It's not surprising that they worked on you too. But I should have trusted you. I should have remembered who you actually are instead of believing Dad's version of who you used to be. This was perhaps the most important conversation we'd had in years. Sophie, your father wasn't entirely wrong about who I was during our marriage. I was financially dependent, and I did let him make most of the important decisions. But that was who I was then, not who I became after. I gestured toward the estate grounds that surrounded us. All of this happened because I finally learned to trust my own judgment and stop accepting other people's limitations on what I could achieve. "When did you know?" she asked. "When did you realize you could build something like this?" "The day I walked through these ruins for the first time," I said, remembering that afternoon 12 years ago when everyone thought I was making the worst mistake of my life. I could see what this place could become, even when no one else could. That's when I understood that other people's opinions about my capabilities were just opinions, not facts. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. I let them do the same thing to me, didn't I? I let them convince me that my opinions about my own wedding didn't matter. But you found your way back, I pointed out. That's what matters now. The wedding that took place 3 weeks later was everything Sophia had originally dreamed of, and more. The intimate guest list meant that every person present truly cared about the couple, creating an atmosphere of genuine celebration rather than social obligation. The ceremony in the gazebo was simple and elegant, with Marcus's heartfelt vows bringing tears to everyone's eyes, including mine. Sophia looked radiant in her grandmother's restored wedding dress, walking down the aisle through gardens that had been lovingly tended specifically for this moment. The string quartet, familiar with every acoustic nuance of the estate, provided music that seemed to emerge naturally from the landscape itself. James Mitchell's catering was flawless, featuring locally sourced ingredients that complemented rather than competed with the estate's natural beauty. The reception in the ballroom felt warm and intimate, with enough space for everyone to dance without feeling lost in an oversized venue. But the moment that meant the most to me came during the father-daughter dance, when Robert approached me, with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been respect or possibly even admiration. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I spent years telling Sophia you were financially irresponsible, and I was completely wrong. What you've built here is extraordinary." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched by his admission, though I should point out that I built it precisely because you told me I couldn't. He actually smiled at that. "Maybe I did you a favor then, without meaning to." "Maybe you did." As the evening progressed, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The months of humiliation and exclusion had been painful, but they had also led to something I hadn't expected: the complete restoration of my relationship with my daughter. Sophia found me during the reception, radiant with happiness and champagne. "Mom, I have something to tell you," she said, pulling me aside. "What's that?" "Marcus and I have been talking, and we want you to know that we've learned something important from all of this. When we have children, we want them to know their grandmother as she really is, not the version that other people tried to create, but the woman who built something beautiful from nothing and never gave up on what she believed in." The tears I'd been holding back all evening finally spilled over. "That's the most beautiful wedding gift you could have given me." As the last guests departed and Helena's staff began the cleanup, I stood in the ballroom where it all began, surrounded by the beauty I'd spent 12 years creating. The crystal chandeliers caught the moonlight streaming through the French doors, and the polished floors reflected the fairy lights that would remain until morning. Sophia and Marcus had left for their honeymoon that afternoon, but not before. Sophia hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for not letting them take this away from us." Helena found me there an hour later, still processing everything that had happened. "So," she said with a smile, "how does it feel to be the mysterious owner of Grandview Estate?" I laughed, realizing that the secret I'd kept for 12 years was now completely in the open. "Different than I expected," Better, actually. Any regrets about revealing yourself? I thought about this question as I looked around the ballroom where my daughter had danced with joy just hours earlier. None at all. I spent 12 years building this place to create perfect moments for other people. Tonight, I finally got to create one for myself. As I walked back to the carriage house that Vivienne had dismissed as inadequate, I realized that the woman who had tried to exclude me from my daughter's wedding had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to show my daughter exactly who I really was, and to discover that she loved me not despite my success, but because of the strength it represented. The drizzling mist I'd stood in outside these same doors months earlier had given way to a clear, star-filled night. As I unlocked the door with the same gold master key that had shattered Vivienne's composure, I smiled at the perfect symmetry of it all. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, building something beautiful, and never letting anyone convince you that you're smaller than you know yourself to be. The estate was quiet now, ready for the next celebration, the next family's perfect moment. And I was ready too, not as the anonymous owner hiding behind business names and intermediaries, but as exactly who I'd always been, a woman who refused to accept other people's limitations on what she could achieve. It had taken 12 years, and one devastating confrontation to fully understand that lesson, but it was worth every difficult moment to finally be seen and valued for who I truly was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.